Hello and welcome to Module 2. So in this module, we're going to be talking about the relational model. We're going to be analyzing a little bit more about what a relational database actually is. We're going to be learning about query by example, and we're going to talk a little bit about relational algebra. So in this first segment, we're just going to be analyzing what a relational database model is and diving in a little bit deeper into what that actually entails. So as we've seen by now, a relational database is essentially just a collection of tables. And so these tables are referred to as relations. And so each table stores its own unique entity. And so how does the relational database handle these entities and the attributes of the entities and then the relationship between them? And it does this by storing each entity in its own table, and then that table has those associated attributes of those entities. For example, our JCC database has several different tables in it, different relations in it, right? It has the employees and the clients and the projects, and each one of them has their own attributes, right? In the employees table, we have last name, we have employee ID, title, things like that. Same with all the other tables, clients, projects, they all have their own attributes. And so these attributes of these entities are the fields or columns for the table. So how do relationships come into play? Well, relationships are kind of what connect the two tables together or multiple tables together. In our example of JC Consulting, right, we have a one-to-many relationship between our clients and our projects, meaning that one client can have many projects. There's that one-to-many relationship. And the way that we implement that relationship between two tables, the way that we tie them together, is by having them share a common attribute, a common column within both tables. In this example of the one-to-many relationship between clients and projects, they both share the column of client ID, right? In the clients table, the client ID is the one part of the relationship, meaning that client ID only exists one time within that table, right? There's only one unique client ID. And then projects is the many part of the relationship, meaning that there can be many projects with that same client ID, right? So for example, client ID number 3 is Mid-States Auto Auction, right? And so they have multiple projects. They got project ID number 3 and they got project ID number 8, and same with other clients. And that's how we create that one-to-many relationship, or any relationship within our database, is by incorporating common columns within multiple tables. And so that's how we tie those two relations together. And so each attribute or each column within a table should have a descriptive unique name, usually relatively short, that describes what that attribute is for that table. And so obviously, each entry in that column should have, the appropriate data related to that attribute. And so our rows for our tables should contain information that is not repeated, right? It should be unique. In our clients table, we have our client ID, and so we can't repeat the same client in there, right? That's going to cause issues and errors within our database. So each row essentially is a unique client ID. Let me go back real quick 1 second. I just want to add in another note about the columns in the attributes, right? So the information that goes in each column should be consistent among each row, meaning that, like, for example, if you have an attribute, a column that describes like the weight of something, you don't want to have an entry, one entry be in pounds and then another entry be in, kilograms, things like that. It needs to be consistent. A relation or a table, in simplistic terms, is just basically a two-dimensional table, right? Consisting of rows and columns, very similar to a spreadsheet for that one particular table. And so having a relation, a properly formatted and what we call normalized relation, should have these following requirements be true. The first one being that there is only a single value per entry. And so what we mean by that is that at any point where a row and column meet, so for every attribute of every row, of every record of the table, there needs to be just a single value. Later on, in a few modules further down the road, we're going to talk about unnormalized cases where we have multiple values. But for right now, for a normalized table, we want single values for each entry of each record. Each attribute has a distinct name, right? We need to be able to distinguish between each column. If they don't have distinct names, it's going to make it hard to do that. Values in an attribute, values in a column, should match that of the attribute that they're in, meaning that if you have two different columns, one being day of the week and one being time, you don't put the time inside the day of the week column. And then each row, each record is distinct. We've talked about that before, like with the customer ID. And then lastly, both the order of the rows and the order of the columns are inconsequential. They don't matter. When we retrieve a record, it's going to pull up all of that relevant data, but the order of that doesn't matter because we can reference the specific data that we want by referring to those column attribute names. When we need to write out our database, we have what we refer to as shorthand notation. And this is just essentially a standard to describe the database and the tables within it in a common way that everybody can understand. And so the way that we do that is by writing each relation, each table, on its own separate line, and we're going to start off with the table name, and then we're going to have parentheses, and inside those parentheses we're going to have each attribute and the attribute name separated by a comma. So let me kind of show you what that looks like. So using this same example of our JC Consulting, we're going to have our, I'll enlarge this a little bit for you guys. There we go. We're going to have our employees table, right? So there's our table name. And then we're going to have our attributes, and inside our attributes, we're going to have, inside of our parentheses, we're going to have our attributes, our column names. So we have our employee ID. So there's one, and then we're going to separate it by a comma. Last name, first name, hire date, title, and salary. So there we have the name of our table, and then each attribute corresponding to that relation. And so there is one table within our database, and I'm not going to add in all of them, but I will pause the recording real quick to add in a couple more. All right, so there I've added in two more of our relations, two more of our tables. We have our clients, and we have our project ID, our projects table. And so you can kind of see that they all follow that same standard format, right? Table name, parentheses, and then the attribute for each table. And so you can kind of see the column names, the way that they're written. That's something that we refer to as camel case, meaning that, you know, when you can't use spaces like that, you just capitalize the first letter of each word so that it's just easier to recognize and easier to see and understand. So you'll notice, and we've kind of talked a little bit about this already, that some of these columns, some of these column names are duplicated, right? We mentioned that that's how we create the relationships between our tables, by having that same column ID, that same column name, same attribute within multiple tables, right? So that can present a problem, because when we need to reference one specific column, one specific attribute, if it's one that's duplicated in another table, well, now how are we going to distinguish that? And so the way that we do that is by qualifying the column name. And so what I mean by that, let me expand this a little bit more, is that we're just going to specify the table first and then the column. So for example, we can see that we have client ID here in our clients table, and we also have client ID here in our projects table. So if I want to reference this specific client ID column, well, I'm just going to start off with table name, projects, followed by a period, and then the attribute, client ID. And so there, by using the table name, I have what we call qualified the column name. All right, so the last thing that I really want to talk about in this segment are keys. And we're going to talk about keys more later on, but there's a few different keys, but one of the main ones that we're always concerned with is what we call the primary key. And so I mentioned earlier that inside of our relations, inside of our tables, each row, each record needs to be unique. And so there needs to be an attribute that uniquely identifies each record, right? So if we look at these examples that I have on the screen, employee ID does that, right? Nobody is going to have the same employee ID. It uniquely identifies each record within that table. Same with client ID and project ID. So these attributes, these columns, these are the primary keys for these corresponding tables. So the primary keys are fairly important to a table. And so coming back to our shorthand notation here, the primary key is always going to be the first attribute listed in our notation. So that's why I have all of the IDs here listed first. And so to further identify the primary key, they're also going to be underlined. It's hard to see on some of them with the spell check there, but you can see client ID underlined, right? So when you see an attribute that is underlined, that identifies the primary key for that relation. And so corresponding to that is we also have what's called a foreign key. And so all a foreign key essentially is a primary key from another table. And so what I mean by that is, if our client ID is our primary key in clients, well, we know that our client ID also exists in projects, so that's going to be a foreign key within projects. And the way that we identify that within our shorthand notation is by making it in italics. So we got client ID there. We also have employee ID there from the employees. And so our projects table, our projects relations, has the primary key of project ID, and then it also has two foreign keys of both client ID and employee ID. So again, we'll talk more about keys later on, but I just kind of wanted to bring it up now because I'm showing you the shorthand notation, so I wanted to show you what it looks like when you see that in there. So that's pretty great. Yep, so that wraps up this first segment for Module 2. I hope you guys have learned something, and we'll see you in the next segment.